In September of 2024, the workers at a glass plant in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, got the news the ordinary way. A notice, an announcement, nothing dramatic in the delivery. The plant was 132 years old. More than 300 people worked there. The equipment was going to be moved 170 miles west to a town in Ohio called Lancaster. The company doing the moving was called Anchor Hocking. If that name means nothing to you, go look in your kitchen cabinet. The measuring cup with the red lettering, the heavy glass baking dish your grandmother refused to throw out, the mixing bowl that has outlived 3 of your microwaves. There is a decent chance one of them says Anchor Hocking on the bottom. And there is a very good chance you have never once wondered what happened to the company that made it. So let me tell you. It starts with $25,000 and 7 men in Ohio. It ends with a closing notice and a private equity firm that most Americans have never heard of.
In 1905, a man named Ike Collins went looking for money. He was not a glassmaker by trade. He was a salesman. What he had was a location and an idea, and the location mattered more than people usually admit. Here is why. Glass is sand and soda ash and lime, heated until it stops being a solid. To do that, you need a furnace running somewhere north of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and you cannot turn it off. A glass tank runs day and night, year after year, because letting it cool and reheating it will crack the refractory brick and cost you a fortune. Fuel is not a line item in the glass business. Fuel is the business. And Lancaster, Ohio, was sitting on top of cheap natural gas. Burn fuel that comes out of the ground under your own feet, and you can undercut anyone in the country. That was the whole insight. Collins was a salesman who understood a map. He talked 7 investors into backing him. A man named E.B. Good led the group. Together, they put up $25,000. He named the company after the river that ran past the town, the Hocking Glass Company. The first year, they made lamp chimneys, little glass sleeves that fit around an oil flame to keep it from guttering and smoking up the room. Not a glamorous product, but in 1905, every house in America needed them, and every single one of them eventually broke, which is exactly what you want to be making when you are starting out with borrowed money. Total sales that first year came to $20,000. Hold on to that number. It matters later. By 1919, the company had 300 people on the payroll and was doing $900,000 a year. And that same year, Hocking hired the man who changed everything.
His name was William V. Fisher, and what he did was not glamorous either. He worked on machines. You have to understand what glassmaking looked like before him, because it is closer to a medieval workshop than to a factory. A gatherer walks up to the tank with an iron rod and dips it into molten glass. He turns the rod so the glass does not run off. He carries a glowing lump across the shop floor to a press. Another man works the press. The glass gets squeezed into shape and goes into a lair, which is a long tunnel oven that cools it down slowly over hours so it does not shatter from the temperature drop. Everything is hot, everything is heavy, everybody has burns, and the whole line moves at the speed of the slowest man on it. The rate was about 1 piece per minute. Fisher automated the pressing, and the number went from 1 piece per minute to 20. Then to 35. That sounds like an improvement. It is not. It is a different industry. A shop making 60 pieces an hour is now making 2,100. Same building, same town, 35 times the output. It also meant something else, and the histories tend to skip past this part. The skill that a gatherer spent 15 years acquiring was now worth a great deal less. That is what automation does. It makes the product cheap, and it makes the craftsman ordinary, and both of those things happened in Lancaster at the same time. The town got richer. Individual men got replaceable. Nobody in 1919 was writing that down as a problem, because the payroll was still growing. Then, in 1924, the Lancaster plant burned down.
Fisher rebuilt it, and he did not rebuild what had been there. The new plant had gravity-fed tanks and small batch feeders, which meant molten glass moved through the building continuously instead of being carried around by men holding iron rods. 5 years after that, the stock market collapsed and the American economy fell off a cliff. And this is the part of the story I did not expect. The Depression should have killed Hocking Glass. Nobody buys glassware when they cannot buy dinner. Instead, Fisher built a machine that could turn out 90 glasses per minute at half the previous cost. 90 a minute, 5,400 an hour, cheap enough that a company could give them away for free and still come out ahead. That is where Depression glass comes from. You have seen it even if you did not know the name. Pale green, soft pink, amber, a little wavy, usually with a pattern pressed into it. Those pieces turn up at every estate sale in America, and people collect them now for real money. They were not luxury goods, they were free. They came packed in the oatmeal box, the gas station handed you one for filling up, the movie theater gave out a plate on Wednesday nights to get people through the door in a decade when nobody had a spare quarter. Flour companies put them in the sack. Think about what that actually was. In the worst economic decade in American history, a factory in Ohio worked out how to put a pretty piece of glass into the hand of a family that had almost nothing, and to do it at a price where somebody still made money. I find that genuinely moving, and I think it explains why this company got into people's hearts the way it did. Anchor hawking never really sold to the rich. It made ordinary objects for ordinary kitchens at a price ordinary people could reach, and it did that for the better part of a century. That is not marketing. That is what the machines were built to do.
In 1931, the company bought Turner Glass. In 1937 came the merger everybody knows the name of. Hocking Glass combined with the Anchor Cap and Closure Corporation, and the result was Anchor Hocking. That merger brought something else with it. A plant in Salem, New Jersey, built in 1863, the oldest glass manufacturing facility in the United States. Anchor Hocking would run it for the next 46 years. 3 years before the merger, in 1934, Hocking had already done something that quietly changed how America drinks. They developed the first non-returnable beer bottle. Before that, a beer bottle was equipment. The brewery owned it. You drank the beer, you brought the bottle back. They washed it and refilled it, and the cycle started again. That system put a hard limit on how far beer could travel, because a bottle 200 miles away was a bottle you were never getting back. A bottle you could throw away sounds like a small thing. It is the reason a brewery in Milwaukee could sell beer in Arizona. Then the war came, and after the war came the boom. In 1939, the company put out its first line under its own name, Royal Ruby. Deep red pressed glass, and if you have ever seen a piece, you remember it, because there is nothing subtle about it.
Then came Fire King. Fire King was heat-resistant glass, and it went everywhere. Jadeite green mugs and plates and mixing bowls that ended up in diners across the country because they were tough enough to survive a commercial kitchen and cheap enough to replace when they finally lost. If you have ever seen a photograph of an American lunch counter in the 1950s, you have probably seen Fire King in it without knowing. Then Anchor Ovenware, then Forest Green.
In 1950, Anchor Hocking sponsored an NBC program called Broadway Open House. That show is one of the direct ancestors of American late-night television. So a glass company in Lancaster, Ohio, helped pay for the invention of the format that eventually gave us Johnny Carson. By 1963, annual sales were over $150 million, with profits above $6 million. And at the peak, in the years after the war, Anchor Hocking employed more than 5,000 people out of a single Ohio town. It was the largest glassware manufacturer in the world, from $20,000 in lamp chimneys to that in about 50 years. Now I need you to understand what 5,000 jobs meant to Lancaster, because the rest of this story does not make sense otherwise. 5,000 jobs in a town that size is not an employer, it is the town. Take a street. The man on the corner runs a furnace. 2 doors down is a guy in the mold shop. His wife does inspection on second shift. Their neighbor drives a truck for a supplier that exists only because the plant exists. The hardware store, the diner, the car dealership, the dentist, all of them are downstream of one payroll. And here is the piece that got lost. The men who ran Anchor Hocking lived there too. They went to church in Lancaster. Their kids went to the same schools as the kids of the men working the furnaces. When the hospital needed a wing, when the park needed money, when the library roof went, there was a short list of people to call, and every one of them lived about 10 minutes from the plant. I am not going to romanticize this. It was paternalistic. The power ran in exactly one direction, and everyone knew it. If the company decided something, the town got the decision. But it meant one concrete thing. The people making the decisions had to live next door to the consequences. Then 1987 happened. To understand 1987, you have to understand what was happening in American business at that moment. The 1980s produced a new idea, and the idea was this. A lot of old American companies were worth more broken apart than they were worth running. They had real estate. They had pension funds sitting fat. They had brand names with a century of goodwill attached. And a lot of them were run conservatively by people who thought their job was to still be there in 30 years. If you could borrow enough money to buy one of those companies, you could sell the pieces, take the cash, and walk away richer than the company had made anyone in a decade. The debt markets of that era were happy to lend you the money to try. That is the world Anchor Hocking woke up in. In 1987, a company called Newell mounted a hostile takeover. Hostile means the people running Anchor Hocking did not want to sell. Newell bought it anyway, over their objections, by going around them to the shareholders. What happened next took almost no time. Newell fired the executives. Then it closed the corporate headquarters in downtown Lancaster. A resident, quoted years afterward, put it about as plainly as anyone has. It ripped the heart out of this town. And this is the part that never shows up in the story because it does not look like damage. The factory kept running. Jobs still existed. If you looked at Lancaster on a spreadsheet in 1988, you would have struggled to find the damage. But the new executives lived in Columbus. They drove in, and they drove home. They were not at the school board meeting. They were not on the hospital board. They were not sitting in a pew on Sunday next to a man whose forearms were scarred from 30 years on a furnace line. The civic machinery of that town had been running on the personal involvement of the people who ran the plant. One afternoon that stopped, and nothing came in to replace it. That is the moment. Not a bankruptcy, not a closure. A headquarters closing and a few families moving 45 minutes north. Everything after 1987 is arithmetic. Because after that, Anchor Hocking stopped being a company and became an asset. This part gets told as a cartoon a lot, and it deserves better than that. So I am just going to lay out the ownership in order, and you can make of it what you want. In 1983, before the takeover, the glass container division had already been spun off into a separate business called Anchor Glass Container. The company was being taken apart before Newell ever showed up. In 2004, Anchor Hocking was sold to Global Home Products, which was backed by the investment firm Cerberus. 2 years later, in 2006, Global Home Products went bankrupt. Out of that bankruptcy, Anchor Hocking was bought by Monomoy Capital Partners. In 2012, Monomoy merged Anchor Hocking with Oneida, the silverware company, and named the combination Everywhere Global. In 2015, Everywhere Global filed for bankruptcy. In 2017, what survived renamed itself again, the Oneida Group. In 2021, Lennox acquired the Oneida consumer business, and control passed to Center Lane Partners. That same year, the Monaca, Pennsylvania plant was sold off to an Austrian glassmaker called Stölzl. Count that.
In roughly 17 years, this company had 4 different investment owners and went through 2 bankruptcies. In the 82 years before that, it had 1 owner and 1 name. So, what does that actually do to a factory? Let me explain the mechanism plainly, because it is not magic, and it is not illegal. A buyout usually works like this. An investment firm puts in a small amount of its own money and borrows the rest. Then the borrowed money gets attached to the company that was just bought. So the company now owes the debt that was used to purchase it. It has to service that debt out of what it earns every quarter before anything else. Which means the arithmetic inside the plant changes completely. Maintenance is a cost this year. The benefit shows up in some future year that probably belongs to whoever owns the place next. So maintenance gets deferred. A machine that should be rebuilt gets patched. Cleaning gets skipped. The heat handling gets a little worse, and then a little worse than that. Brian Alexander, who spent a long time reporting in Lancaster, described what that adds up to. Machinery breaking down, maintenance and cleaning neglected, and workers leaving for safer minimum wage jobs at distribution centers and big box stores. Read that last part again, because it is the quiet killer. The people who leave first are the ones with the most experience, because they are the ones with options. Every year, the plant gets a little less capable, and the loss does not show up on any statement anybody publishes. I do not have the internal financials. I cannot tell you exactly what was taken out, in what year, by whom. Those numbers are not public, and I am not going to invent them for you. What I can tell you is what showed up on the outside. The workforce that had peaked above 5,000 was down to roughly 1,400 by the 1990s. And in Lancaster today, the jobs that exist mostly pay minimum wage, and in some cases, once you account for scheduling and contracting, effectively less than that. There is one more number, and it is the one I have not been able to stop thinking about. In Fairfield County, Ohio, where Lancaster is, 58% of the children in the child welfare system have parents who used opiates. 58%.
Now, a glass company did not cause an opiate epidemic, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. That would be lazy, and it would be wrong. Plenty of towns that never had a factory got hit just as hard. But hold two things at once. A town where 5,000 people had work that paid enough to buy a house and raise a family. And that same town, 3 generations on, where most of the kids taken into care have a parent on opiates. Something ran out between those two facts, and I do not think it was only money. Which brings us back to Charleroi. Charleroi, Pennsylvania, sits on the Monongahela River about 40 miles south of Pittsburgh. It is one of those valley towns that industry built and then left, and there has been a glass plant there since 1893. For most of its modern life, that plant made Pyrex, the measuring cup with the red markings on the side, the casserole dish, the loaf pan, the stuff that goes from the oven to the table and does not shatter when it hits cold air. If you own one piece of American glass, the odds are good it is Pyrex, and for over a century, the odds were good it came out of Charleroi.
In June of 2023, Instant Brands, which owned Pyrex at the time, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In February of 2024, Center Lane Partners bought the housewares division out of that bankruptcy and reorganized it as Corel Brands. Center Lane, remember, already controlled Anchor Hocking. In March of 2024, Anchor Hocking took over the Charleroi plant. In September of 2024, 6 months later, they announced they were closing it. More than 300 jobs, 132 years of continuous production, the work moving 170 miles west to Lancaster, Ohio. There is something almost unbearable about that geography. The glass town that got hollowed out is now the destination for equipment leaving another glass town that is about to get hollowed out. Lancaster does not win here. Lancaster just goes last. The reaction was loud. Senator Bob Casey wrote to the company directly. His line was this: "Your sudden announcement to close the plant will upend the lives of Pennsylvania workers who have contributed to your company's success." Senator John Fetterman went further and called on federal authorities to, in his words, scrutinize, investigate, and review the bankruptcy proceedings and apparent ownership transactions. The union at the plant, United Steelworkers Local 5G3, filed a demand to bargain and held rallies in the street. They said publicly that they were open to a different owner, anyone, any buyer at all who would keep the furnaces lit. Anchor Hocking did not respond to requests for comment. The plant closed in April of 2025.
So what happened to Anchor Hocking? And this is why the story is so hard to tell, which is probably also why you have never heard it. Nothing happened. There was no fire, no scandal with a name attached to it, nobody in handcuffs. There was never a single morning when the gates went shut and a photographer happened to be standing there. The company still exists. You can buy an Anchor Hocking bowl this afternoon, brand new, and it will probably outlive your kitchen. The brand did not die. What died was the arrangement underneath it. The arrangement where a glass company and a town were the same object. Where the man who decided whether to rebuild the furnace had to see the man who worked in front of it on Sunday in the same building. Where 5,000 paychecks came out of one set of buildings and went straight back into one set of streets. That arrangement was not destroyed by anybody. It was sold, repeatedly, in pieces,
over about 40 years, to buyers who were never going to live there, and who were, in fairness to them, doing precisely what they were set up to do. Ike Collins raised $25,000 in 1905 to make lamp chimneys, and out of that he built something that fed a town for 3 generations. And then one day it was worth more taken apart than it was worth kept together. That is not a conspiracy. Nobody had to break a law. It is simply what happens when the thing holding a place together is also a thing that can be purchased. Go look at the bottom of that bowl in your cabinet. Somebody in Lancaster, Ohio made that. And for a long time, that was a good job.